Welcome to Brelyon, and thanks for coming all the way to be here.
It's exciting to be here to see what amazing things you're doing here at Brelyon.
We have a long history and working at computational imaging at MIT, and I have been away from MIT for 5 years now. It almost feels like a lifetime. So what's coming up in the field?
MIT Media Lab and MIT in general is, always working at the intersection of the society and technology. And by the way, Barmak, we still have some, when you were a scientist in my group at MIT, in addition to the fundamental research you did, a lot of the amazing kind of future possible scenarios that you had created in AI, in augmented reality, in batteries, and so on. Those displays are still out there. So, visitors at MIT always ask, who created this?
Yeah, I remember we got into trouble because I was drawing so much around on the walls and everything.
That's right. It goes back to your creativity back then at MIT.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
So, some of the areas we are focusing on at MIT and at the MIT Media Lab are themes such as the future world that includes, sustainability, ideas in decentralized society, as technologies allow us to interact with each other through, not a centralized entities. So that's decentralized society. Life post AI, if we assume AI is already widely distributed,
right,
what will our life look like? Cultivating creativity, which continues to be a challenge despite all the technology, and also connected mind and body. This has always been an emphasis at the MIT Media Lab. So overall at MIT Media Lab, under the new leadership, our focus is on kind of human and planetary health with focus on biology, space, AI, and sensors.
I understand. So that's a very broad, way to think about it. But if you go further down into like AI and imaging cameras, what do you think is a new trend? I remember that there was a lot of work that has been done in sort of connecting ML to scientific imaging, of course, in the field. But what do you feel like is the trend now? What's popping, and what's maybe overhyped, and what are the areas that people should look into a little bit more?
That's a very good question. I mean, it's difficult to say hyped, but we can say, the promises haven't been delivered yet in some of these areas. They remain exciting. If you think about holographic displays or meta optics, or this promise that robotics will solve a lot of our problems, and also kind of the consumerization of fields like AR, VR, and AVs. I think these are some, you can call them hyped, or the promises haven't been delivered. On the other hand, there has been some dramatic and very exciting progress in areas like low light imaging using SPADs, using single photon avalanche diode sensors, or ability to use LiDARs in new ways. And of course, optics continues to get better and better. So I would say some of the slow and steady areas of progress have unnecessarily been overshadowed by these hyped areas that are taking too long to deliver. So I think it's kind of important to realize that we overestimate in the short run what technology can deliver, and underestimate in the long run.
One of the areas that I think is very interesting to me, and I've been looking at it closely, is the intersection of generative AI and cameras. And if you have capabilities to train these cameras, train these models, and generate the images that you want, why do you even need to take pictures?
It's a good question. It's a good question. I mean, we have to remember that the goal of photography and imaging in general is shifting from realistic to unusual to impossible.
Right.
And a lot of people think photography is about creating realistic images, but usually the photos we really appreciate are unusual in some sense. Either they have a very unique viewpoint, or they provide a very strange context, and so on. And let me come back and talk about impossible. But even in the unusual regime, the role of generative AI, simply said, is to create known unknowns, but not the unknown unknowns, right? So if you want to create an image
explain that more. Known unknowns and unknown unknowns.
That's right.
So tell me more about that. What do you mean?
So a known unknown means if what you're creating is kind of within the simplex, within the linear combination of what's out there, then any generative AI method is going to do a reasonably good job today. On the other hand, if it's an unknown unknown, if it's something that hasn't been studied, hasn't been captured, or hasn't been captured in the right context, then it's very difficult to create something of that kind. And that's where human ingenuity comes in. And yes, I would argue that yet another picture of Taj Mahal or yet another picture of Eiffel Tower has a marginal value. But if you really care about 4 areas that really matter for unusual photos, one is the context, and that could be, again, as I said, the viewpoint, interaction, so on. Second is authenticity, which you might care about, for news or journalism or just kind of personal memory. Third is something that you cannot remember or something you cannot capture. It could be, somebody, you spilling a coffee on your shirt. It's a funny moment,
right?
And so on. And the fourth is something that's live. Think about sports. Think about, sharing, a birthday party or being away from your family and giving them a virtual tour of what you're working on or what meal you're enjoying. So if you take those 4 areas, they fall in the kind of the unknown regime with respect to generative AI. So that's an unusual part. But if you go to the third bucket, so realistic, unusual, and impossible, the impossible photos of tomorrow, will not be just captured, but they'll be computed. So the impossible photo would be the kind of things we worked in our group at MIT Media Lab, cameras that can see around corners. Or one of your favorite projects that you worked on, is cameras that can read through a book without opening it page by page. So there are many kind of these impossible photos that we really crave to create. Think about all the superheroes in movies and all the capabilities they have. And they have this seemingly impossible capabilities. And those are the kind of new cameras, new sensors, new AI that we really care about. So I hope we have kind of moved away from realistic. We are now in the regime of unusual to impossible photos. And I think generative AI is going to play a very critical role in all these 3 phases. But the role for cameras, the role for human creativity and context will remain.
That's a very interesting point, because I was thinking that, what if you just had like a 360 camera on your cell phone, like a little, blob there, and it would just record a video and it would generate all the Instagram perfect shots of you. You didn't even have to like bother anymore to take a selfie.
Yes.
And I think what you're saying is that, yeah, that may happen, but that wouldn't have novelty factor, because that novelty is actually an abstract concept that we humans have, which is like, okay, this happened actually at this moment, or this has some relation with the story of my life that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, if you think about 360 cameras, it is true that today's cameras are not satisfactory. If you just think about the human vision with 120, 150 degree field of view, a frameless notion of capturing photons. So we don't really have a notion of a frame rate, or we don't have a notion of noise, because we simply will see in pitch dark and we hallucinate what the image could look like. Our brain never perceives the noisy image, and so on. So I think cameras have still ways to go in that sense. Whether it's 360 or multispectral, or being able to see low light, or having a very impressive zoom, abilities for cameras to interact with each other, abilities for cameras to capture 3-dimensional, I call it more 6-dimensional experiences, where it's not just viewpoint changes, but lighting changes, and so on. So I think there are lots of things we need to do. I gave a talk like 2006 on kind of wish list for photography, and I think some of those things have come along, but I would say 80-90% of that is still on my wish list.
So 6-dimensional photography, I think viewers probably haven't thought about that, but what do you mean by 6-dimension? So you have X, Y, Z, and you have what?
It's more than that, because imagine if you went on a trip,
right,
and you saw this beautiful flower and you took a picture of it, and then you came back to your house and it's sitting in a photo frame, and you want that flower to look like it was when you were in that garden. You need 6 dimensions. You need, of course, the X, Y. Then you need some viewpoint changes. That's UV, but you also need some lighting changes. So imagine the light is moving in another two dimensions. So the flower, to look realistic, sitting in your house as a photo frame, should respond to viewpoints like a Harry Potter kind of scenario, but also responds to a natural light that's in a room. So I think like creating this, it's a truly impressive, light view interpolation as well as incident light interpolation. And I think we have the abilities to create cameras that can capture, at least close-ups, scenes where light changes, artificially, and we can capture this, six-dimensional data sets and transport them to, new generation of photo frames, or as you would experience them in other settings.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Like, when you have that much training data set and you can basically render the 3D object and, light it from anywhere, and, it's like it has already been captured from so many angles that you can always predict what's going to look like in different lights and different angles.
Yeah.
I agree to that. And another thing that I think is very interesting in this domain where you have generative AI and, cameras is the image compression. So what do you think about that? Because, having that realistic video conferencing has always been a kind of like this dream that everybody has chased, but it never really has worked. There's this kind of packet protocols on the net that creates this delay, and so you have to use a certain class of bandwidth on the internet to be able to do video conferencing. So that has limited the quality of the video conferencing and the fact that it's real time, and you're sending signals over the globe and so on. How can generative AI really help with compression of those? Because it's, after all, a talking head on a video conferencing, right? How can that help and make our telepresence more effective?
It's definitely true that generative AI and machine learning in general is playing a very critical role in areas like compression, image enhancement, super resolution, and so on, especially dealing with noise. But what's really interesting, Barmak, is that these ideas are playing a role not just for, let's call it interpolation, which is ability to create intermediate frames, or denoise, certain patches, and so on. And that will continue to improve, as you said, in terms of bandwidth and compute, and so on. The real dream of generative AI is actually not just improving interframe, which is interpolation, but predicting future frames. And I'm looking forward to that.
So help me imagine that future with predictive frames. I think it's we do upscaling in spatial domain, so we can go from lower resolution image to high resolution image, no problem. There has been a lot of work to go from 2D images to 3D images, no problem. But you're talking about temporal interpolation.
We're talking about predicting the future.
Predicting the future. So,
by a few frames.
So how would that fit into the context of video conferencing? So I can know, the computer knows what you're gonna say before you say it.
Yes.
So you can actually compress that delay in the video conferencing experience. Is that what you're referring to?
So for longest time, good communication systems are trying to reduce that latency, but in other fields, whether it's vehicles, whether it's sensors, we have figured out the only way to deal with latency is by being really good at prediction.
Right.
And if you have to predict the future, then when you're talking, the reason somebody interrupts you is because you already kind of know what the person is going to say. With a pretty good accuracy. Once in a while you might get it wrong, but you're pretty good. And that's why when there's a good chemistry between people, which means they can effectively predict what each other is going to say, literally finishing your sentences, they're able to predict by several seconds. But for video, if you can predict by 10 frames or 20 frames, about half a second, I think we'll be in an amazing regime. In that sense. Yeah.
So I'm just imagining taking this to extreme, right? Like when you're trying to have a Zoom call from Earth to Mars, and it takes like several seconds. And as soon as you start, saying some words, the computer on the other side has already predicted what you're gonna say to the end of it, and basically kind of fill in the gaps.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about light field displays, 3D displays. This is a technology that, a lot of people have been working on, trying to really make that a reality. Do you think that generative AI would be finally that sort of magical recipe that was needed to sort of give you that bandwidth that you need for light field displays? Because one of the challenges with 3D displays and light field displays has been lack of content and the large amount of bandwidth that you have. I mean, any holographic article you read is like, oh, they need a terabyte per second kind of like a data, stream. So would this kind of intelligent compression help to sort of finally make light field displays a reality? What do you think?
It's a good point. I mean, we have to remember that when it comes to displays of any kind, there are two very separate problems. One is just the optics and the physics, and the second is compute that includes, bandwidth, image generation capabilities, and ability to interact. And these two are actually very orthogonal, very separate problems. So no matter how much progress we make on the compute side, there's still problems on the physical side. But let's take them one at a time. And also, we want to make sure we make a distinction between holographic displays, which involve diffraction,
absolutely,
and interference, versus light field displays that use lenticulars or lighting tricks, still using rays as representation, versus stereo or /3D, which is sending two different images to the two eyes. It's not truly glasses free. But in the light field and the holographic regime, our assumption is that we can do glasses free 3D. So clearly, I think generative AI will play a very huge role in being able to interpolate between frames. So if you want, you want to create, say, an 8K image with thousands of angular views, that terabits per second, that information we have to generate and display, could potentially be improved with generative AI, because interpolation will become easier, and also you could have machinery that's close to the display, so that the data that's fed to the display is actually very low bandwidth, but on the fly, close to the pixels, it can generate new information. So that's great, but that doesn't necessarily solve the optics and the physics problem, right? Because the problem is you have to create a virtual 3D point that's floating in front of a display. I need to create all the rays that pass through that physical the virtual point that's physically in front of the display. And to create a reasonable vergence accommodation Q within the pupil of your eye, you may have to create a handful of rays, maybe of the order of 10 by 10, maybe 100 rays total. And if you do the math, then it turns out creating the XY resolution is not a problem, but creating the angular resolution that sends like 15 rays, 10 to 15 rays within the your pupil is actually very challenging. You may have to create about 1,000 angular rays per pixel to support that, even within a small field of view.
Yeah, so that's like 1,000 4K displays.
1,000 4K displays, and I think you need some major physical breakthrough, a shift to diffractive optics to be able to support that.
I understand. I think that you also, what's important is like, what do you want to do with that depth, right? And how does that depth fits into the future of work, into the future of your display experience and everyday kind of life or entertainment? And talking about that, like, what do you see would be the future of work and our computer experience? Would we be wearing headsets? Would we be sitting in front of monitors 8 hours a day, or will we just have AI agents typing our keyboards and clicking our mouses and just sort of taking care of all the interactions we have with computers altogether? What do you think about that? Like, what is your vision about future of work with these advancements we have in displays and AI?
Future of work. I should mention that, Barmak, this summer, it's 25 years since my first graduate student paper, a SIGGRAPH paper, and the paper was titled The Office of the Future.
Okay.
And it was all about the future of work. If you read that paper, our SIGGRAPH paper from 1998, it talks about the things we talk about today. The distinction between personal productivity versus collaborative productivity. It talks about the meaning of 2D versus 3D. It talks about how do we interact with information, that's text versus 3D versus somebody else's data, and so on. And I think we have come a long way, but the problems still remain. What we have to remember is that the future of work, or future of, let's call it office work at least, is still going to remain multimodal. Just like today we have, a phone and a laptop and a PC, our world is continuing to evolve in a multimodal manner. So if anybody comes and tells us there's one exact solution that's, be all and end all for future of work, even for a single person, I think that would be a misrepresentation. So I think we need to think about this multimodal aspect. But the second one that's kind of undersatisfying today is so much reliance on keyboard. Just think about that. For the last 50 years in the computing era, we have made human progress one key click at a time.
That's crazy, right?
That's been our interface to make this progress in the world.
I completely feel like that's not sustainable. Like, we have evolved to, like, we have learned how to use keyboard, but just the fact that you have to actually press letter by letter is just such a hassle.
It's amazing. So I think the promise of generative AI to me is being able to be very expressive in our ideas, our creativity, being able to communicate, and so on. And yes, we will still have keyboards, we'll still have mouse, we'll still have other ways to use our bodies, but we should be able to go well beyond that. And my hope is that with generative AI, we'll have a completely new expressive language that allows us to do work at 5-10x efficiency, but also it's more meaningful, it's more emotional, and it allows us to be who we are, just the way we would be with our families. We don't, when with our families, we don't use keyboards, we don't use mouse. We use our natural bodies to be with that. So I think hopefully generative AI will take us in a world where we are more human as we interact with information, just the way we interact with our families.
I think that I
think the future of work is less like Minority Report and more like the movie Her, where it's so natural and it's kind of it's imperceptible. We don't even think about that interaction.
Well, I mean, what is natural? Because I feel like if you look at how we communicated 100 years ago compared to how we communicate today, like we use so many like acronyms and emojis and things like that, right? So in my head, I feel like the language we use compared to like 100 years ago is super natural.
It is.
It's not even natural.
Yeah, the technology does allow us to do new things that we couldn't do with natural expressions.
Yeah, exactly. So I feel like that's kind of the continuation that we're going to see with the generative AI and language models, is that we're going to evolve to this supernatural language, which is maybe we are communicating through colors and pictures, and it's like 100 times faster than actually reading letter by letters.
Right.
So we emit this colorful spectrum that means something. I don't know, but
it's possible. I mean, if you think about just the bio-IO, right? The 7 senses we have, the 5 we know, proprioception and gravity. The 7 inputs we have are actually very rich, especially the visual input.
Right.
But our outputs are very limited, mostly hands and a little bit of voice. So clearly there's an asymmetry as a human in the bandwidth we consume versus the bandwidth of our output.
Absolutely.
And I think my hope is that generative AI will allow us to kind of make it at least more symmetrical.
Yeah.
That as much as we consume, we can respond and create.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think for certain areas where you have sophistication of language, like abstract math and algebra and things like that, you probably still need those symbols and things like that to work that out. But for everyday consumer, that language might get so compressed and so efficient that we wouldn't have to like type letter by letter and or even make a sentence the way we make it today. So that's very interesting. And with that kind of segue into the future and your activity for decades at MIT, what do you think is the future of education, and where would that go with AI? At the time that I was doing research, there was no language models and so on. So how things has changed, and where do you see it going?
I mean, if you think about future of work, it's possible that we don't have to work at all. It's like the movie WALL-E. But coming back to my role as an educator, as a professor, and so on, yes, I think even 10 years ago, over the last decade, the role I teach at a graduate level. My role has changed from somebody who delivers information and knowledge in the world of kind of YouTube and online courses, where you can get a lot of raw information. So my role has already changed from somebody who delivers knowledge to somebody who's more of a coach.
Yeah.
But one thing that's still kind of undersatisfying is ability to engage, for kind of a more personalized coaching, more personalized engagement one-on-one with my students in a class or my own group. So I feel, generative AI in education, just like any other transformation, goes through 3 phases, fix, improve, and transform. And this is true with any revolution. So in the beginning, we're going to fix things like grading and preparing and coordination. Then it'll be about improve, about how do we create better tools for doing work. How do we do more personalized education. But the transformation, I think, is going to come through really unique technological surfaces and interfaces. So of course, AR and VR, being outdoors, learning in context, just in time. The part I'm probably most excited about is continuous learning. If you have a coach who's with you all day, all night, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, you are immersed in that experience with that coach. And I think technology will allow us to do continuous learning, and we might learn things in a matter of days, as opposed to a matter of semesters and years, and so on. I think that's a very exciting world we're going to live in, and of course it'll become there'll be equity, access will improve. Anybody in the world has access to information. As long as they're motivated, as long as they're passionate about doing something good for the world, tools will be available. So I'm very excited about diminishing my role as a professor even more, and letting technology to create these experiences, so that I can go back to focus on what I really like, which is working one-on-one with my students and people who are doing amazing things.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, our time is up, and thank you so much for really being an inspiration to the field, and the way you have immersed yourself in the field of photography has been really an inspiration. So thank you so much for coming over.
Thank you, Barmak.